In the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow, hidden deep within the misty valleys of New England, stood a house that every local knew but dared not speak of. It was an old Victorian, perched on the edge of a dark forest that seemed to swallow any light that tried to touch it. Its once grand facade was now crumbling, its paint chipped and faded, and its roof sagged under the weight of secrets. The town's history was peppered with mysterious tragedies, unexplainable events, and a lingering air of melancholy that never seemed to lift. Black Hollow had once been a bustling place in the 1800s, thriving on the wealth of its iron mines. But one by one, the mines ran dry and the people left, leaving behind a small, insular community that grew more superstitious with every passing generation. The house belonged to the Harrisons, a prominent family during the town's heyday. They had been among the town's elite, living lavishly off the wealth of the mines. But their fortune turned to tragedy. In the winter of 1903, the entire Harrison family vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty house filled with eerie symbols and cryptic scratches on the walls and floors. For over a century, no one dared step inside, except for Eli Marshall. Eli was a renowned paranormal investigator who was known more for debunking hauntings than finding proof. He was driven by a skepticism forged from years of experience, and he prided himself on rational explanations. When he heard about the Harrison house, he knew it would make a perfect addition to his new series, which aimed to debunk infamous haunted places. Despite warnings from the townspeople, Eli arrived on a cold, foggy evening. His car was the only one on the winding road that led to Black Hollow, and as he drove deeper into the town, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with an unexplainable dread. Locals who saw him gave him wary looks, muttering warnings under their breath. When he asked for directions to the Harrison house, people simply shook their heads or whispered, "Leave before it's too late." But Eli was not easily shaken. Armed with an array of equipment, he was determined to stay the night in the house and find out the truth. The approach. It was late afternoon when Eli finally reached the Harrison house. A chill ran through him as he took in the sight of the decaying structure, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. The grass around the house was dead, brittle underfoot, as though even the earth had been poisoned by whatever dwelled within. As Eli approached, he noticed a strange detail. The front door was slightly ajar. Despite years of abandonment, the door had not been boarded up or locked, as though the house itself was inviting him inside. He pushed it open and stepped into the entryway, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rot and mildew. Dust coated every surface, and his footsteps left prints on the wooden floor. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grime-covered windows, he noticed strange symbols scratched into the walls. Symbols he didn't recognize, their jagged shapes twisting in patterns that seemed almost alive. He set up his camera in the main hallway, pointing toward the grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. "This is Eli Marshall, documenting my stay in the infamous Harrison house," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the silence. "Locals say no one has survived a night here without being driven mad. Tonight, I'm here to prove there's nothing to fear." As he spoke, he heard a faint sound, like the whisper of distant voices. He paused, straining to listen, but the sound faded away, leaving only the oppressive silence. Eli brushed it off, attributing it to the house settling or a draft from the broken windows. The first night, Eli's first few hours in the house were uneventful, though unsettling. He documented every strange detail he found. The claw marks on the floorboards, the strange symbols, and a rotting armchair that was inexplicably turned to face a blank wall. Around midnight, as he reviewed his footage, he heard a distinct creak coming from the upstairs. Eli's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to stay calm. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The upstairs was colder, and the smell of decay was stronger. He passed by several rooms with doors slightly ajar, each revealing glimpses of old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. One room, however, caught his attention. A bedroom with an ornate bed, untouched and perfectly made as though waiting for someone to return. He entered the room, his flashlight illuminating the walls, where he found even more symbols, scratched deep into the wood. As he moved closer, he noticed something chilling. The symbols weren't carved with a knife or any sharp tool. They looked as though they'd been scratched by fingernails. A shiver ran down his spine, but Eli pushed it aside. He turned to leave the room, but as he stepped into the hallway, he heard a soft whisper behind him. "Don't go." He whipped around, his flashlight shaking slightly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent. "Just the wind," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. As he turned back to head downstairs, he noticed the scratching sound had started again. Faint but unmistakable. He turned back to look at the walls. This time, his stomach dropped. Where before there had only been a few scratches, now entire sections of the wall were covered with jagged, overlapping symbols. They seemed to pulsate, drawing his eyes in as if he were being hypnotized. The basement. As the night wore on, Eli's nerves were frayed. He tried to distract himself by focusing on his equipment, checking his cameras and adjusting his audio recorders. But the silence of the house seemed to grow thicker, as if it were pressing in on him, suffocating him. At around 3 a.m., his flashlight flickered and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. He fumbled for his phone, using it as a light, but it barely penetrated the oppressive darkness that filled the house. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from the basement. Eli hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out while he still could, but his pride and curiosity overruled his fear. He made his way to the basement door, his hands trembling as he reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as he descended, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. At the bottom of the stairs, his phone's light barely illuminated the space, revealing walls covered in more symbols, carved so deeply that some had cut through the wood into the stone beneath. He noticed a faint glow at the far end of the basement, a strange, flickering light, like a candle. As he moved closer, he saw what appeared to be an altar, surrounded by strange artifacts, a collection of bones arranged in patterns, a lock of hair tied around a rusty nail, and disturbingly, what looked like a small, broken doll with its eyes gouged out. And then he saw it, a message, scratched into the wall above the altar in large, jagged letters. "We wait in the dark." As he stared at the words, the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices, each one pleading, crying, begging. The voices seemed to overlap, merging into a single, guttural voice that hissed, "Join us." Eli's vision blurred, his head pounding as he stumbled back. He felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder, and he turned, only to see nothing. Panic flooded him as he tried to escape, but the basement door had closed, trapping him in darkness. His flashlight flickered back to life for a brief moment, and in its weak glow, he saw them. Shadows taking shape, solidifying into grotesque figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. They reached out to him, their voices merging into a scream that pierced his mind. The descent into madness. By morning, Eli was found by a passerby, lying on the porch, his eyes wide and unfocused. He babbled incoherently, his hands clawing at his skin as if trying to scratch something away. He was taken to the nearest hospital, where he remained catatonic, haunted by visions of the shadows. The footage he recorded was recovered, but most of it was corrupted. The few fragments that remained showed Eli talking to empty rooms, screaming at shadows that weren't there, and scratching symbols into the walls with his bare hands. The Harrison house stands to this day, an empty shell of madness. People say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of those who dared to enter, trapped forever in the shadows. Aftermath. Eli's condition quickly became the subject of town gossip. No one knew exactly what he'd seen in the Harrison house, but word spread fast. Some said he'd been cursed, while others whispered that he'd been claimed by the spirits of the house. For the townsfolk, Eli was no longer just a man. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost walking in daylight, whose mind had been lost to the darkness that dwelled in that forsaken place. The hospital staff watched Eli warily. His catatonia would break only in flashes, brief moments when he'd mutter fragments of strange phrases or scratch at the walls, tracing symbols with his fingers. He'd ramble about shadows, pleading with invisible figures to stop watching him, sometimes speaking directly to an unseen presence, his voice a terrified whisper. "Don't follow me," he'd say. I didn't mean to." Doctors were baffled, and his case drew the attention of psychiatrists from nearby cities. They described Eli's symptoms as a unique form of psychosis, but none could explain his persistent belief that he was still being haunted by the house, even miles away. In his sleep, he'd scream, reliving the horrors he'd witnessed in the basement. Some of the symbols he scratched into his hospital walls matched those found in the house. And then there was the video footage. The remaining fragments, found on Eli's camera, were reviewed by police, doctors, and town officials alike. Some had seen or heard things they couldn't explain. In one clip, they swore they saw the shadowy outline of a figure behind Eli, its twisted limbs reaching toward him, only to disappear in the next frame. The whispers caught on audio, too, were unsettling. There were words, fragments in old dialects, words from dead languages no one could quite place. One voice, deeper than the others, seemed to echo just before the recording cut out. "Welcome, Eli. The house's legacy." The town of Black Hollow had tried to forget about the Harrison house for generations. But with Eli's sudden appearance and the disturbing recordings he left behind, old stories resurfaced. The house's history became the talk of every bar, every gathering. The Harrisons, once a powerful family, had indeed vanished under mysterious circumstances, but few knew the full extent of the tragedy. As Eli's story spread, one old woman came forward, claiming to be the granddaughter of a woman who had worked for the Harrisons before their disappearance. She recalled stories her grandmother had told in hushed tones, stories about strange rituals the family had practiced, ceremonies held in the dead of night, and a hidden room in the basement where no servant was allowed. Some said the Harrisons had been members of a secret society, an ancient order that practiced dark arts, drawing on spirits and forces beyond mortal understanding. The basement altar, the symbols, the eerie arrangement of artifacts. Locals now whispered that these were remnants of the Harrisons' ritualistic past. It was rumored that they had tried to reach beyond the veil, to commune with forces from other realms, but had been consumed by what they summoned. The return. 2 weeks after Eli's encounter, the town's quiet dread grew unbearable. Rumors spread that people had seen shadows moving in their homes at night, fleeting glimpses of distorted figures just outside their windows. Some swore they heard whispers in the dead of night, voices echoing through empty rooms, saying things that felt almost familiar. The town's animals, usually docile, began behaving erratically. Dogs would bark at nothing, staring with wide eyes into dark corners. Cats would hiss and flee certain rooms. The townsfolk began to avoid the area around the Harrison house altogether. The roads leading to the house grew overgrown, as if even nature was trying to keep people away. But despite the dread, there was one who couldn't resist the pull of the house. Eli's younger sister, Mara, arrived in Black Hollow one cold evening, determined to find her brother's lost mind, and perhaps to find answers. She was a journalist, fiercely skeptical like Eli had been, and equally determined. The doctors had told her that Eli's condition was likely irreversible, that he might never recover, but she couldn't accept it. She was convinced that something about the house held the key to understanding what had happened to him. As she drove down the narrow road toward the Harrison house, Mara noticed a change in atmosphere. The sky seemed darker here, the air thicker. She felt a strange heaviness in her chest, a sensation she couldn't shake, like the weight of countless eyes watching her. When she finally reached the house, the sight chilled her to the bone. It looked even worse than in the photos Eli had shown her, as though the house itself had decayed further since his visit. Windows were broken, the front door hung open, and the air was colder, thicker with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Mara entered, her camera and flashlight at the ready. She was a seasoned investigator, but something about the house unsettled her deeply. Every room felt wrong, as if the walls were closing in, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. Descent into darkness. Mara explored the house cautiously, retracing Eli's steps. She found the claw marks, the symbols, and even the abandoned equipment he had left behind. As she moved through the rooms, she documented everything, though the footage seemed off. Sometimes, the recordings would distort, flickering with strange shadows and shapes that she didn't remember seeing. When she reached the basement door, Mara hesitated. She felt a primal fear rise within her, an instinct to flee, but she pushed it down and descended the stairs. The basement was colder, filled with the scent of damp earth and rot. Her flashlight flickered, illuminating the eerie altar and the words Eli had seen scratched into the wall. "We wait in the dark." Mara's heart pounded as she approached the altar. Her camera began glitching, the screen filled with static. And then, for a brief moment, she saw it, a figure, standing in the shadows, watching her. Its face was distorted, its eyes hollow, and it reached out toward her, its fingers impossibly long. The vision faded, but the whispers began. They filled her mind, a cacophony of voices speaking in fragments of forgotten languages. She heard her brother's voice among them, pleading, calling her name. "Help me, Mara." Desperate, she called out to him, demanding that he show himself, to explain what had happened. And then, as if in response, the shadows coalesced, forming shapes that circled her, surrounding her in darkness. She felt something cold and sharp pressing against her mind, a force trying to break into her thoughts. In her final, lucid moment, Mara realized the truth. The Harrisons had not vanished. They had become part of the house, trapped in an endless cycle of horror, feeding off the souls of the curious, the brave, and the foolish. And now, she was part of it too. Epilogue. Months passed, and no one heard from Mara again. Her car was found abandoned outside the Harrison house, but her body was never recovered. Eli remained in his catatonic state, his whispers now joined by a second voice, a woman's, sometimes speaking in harmony with his own, sometimes in strange, half-heard words. The house stands to this day, silent and waiting. Locals say the shadows have grown darker, the whispers louder. Some claim that they can hear Mara's voice, calling for help, pleading to be freed from the darkness. But no one enters a Harrison house anymore. It stands as a monument to the horrors it holds, a prison of shadows that stretches out waiting, ever hungry. And it's said that when the wind howls through Black Hollow, if you listen closely, you can hear them, the voices of the lost, echoing from within the walls, calling out to anyone foolish enough to listen. And the locals, they say that the shadows are growing, that each person who enters adds another voice to the house, another soul lost to its insatiable hunger. Some say that one day, the shadows will spill out, reaching beyond the house, spreading through the town and beyond, until all of Black Hollow is consumed.